What's the cruelest thing that your step-parent does to exclude you? My stepmom, Rachel, had this perfect system for making me invisible in my own house while looking like Mother of the Year to everyone else. She'd plan these elaborate family activities every single weekend, but somehow there was always a reason I couldn't participate. Oh, we only have 4 tickets to the water park and your dad's cousin is visiting. Maybe next time, sweetie. Or she'd sign up her bio kids, Tyler and Madison, for activities that conveniently conflicted with anything I was involved in. Your soccer game is the same day as Tyler's piano recital, and we really need to support him as a family. You understand, right? The worst part was how she'd document everything on Facebook, making it look like we were this perfect blended family. She'd post photos from their outings with captions like "blessed to spend quality time with all my kids," but I was never in any of them because I was always at home or at practice or studying for the test she insisted I needed to focus on. When relatives asked where I was, she'd say things like, "Oh, Jamie preferred to stay home and read," or Jamie had other plans with friends, making it sound like I was choosing to exclude myself. She got really creative with holidays, too. Every Christmas, she'd have matching pajamas for everyone, but mine would mysteriously get lost in shipping. She'd act so disappointed and promise to reorder them, but they'd never arrive in time. For family photos, she'd position me slightly behind everyone or on the edge where I could easily be cropped out later. When planning vacations, she'd always pick dates that conflicted with my school events, then act shocked when she realized. "Oh no, that's the same week as your science fair. Well, you worked so hard on that project, we can't pull you out of school. Grandma can stay with you." My dad was completely oblivious because Rachel was so good at making everything seem accidental, or like she was being considerate of my schedule. She'd even buy me expensive guilt gifts afterward and make a big show of it. "I felt so bad you missed the trip, so I got you this new laptop for school." Everyone thought she was so thoughtful and generous. She turned my own extended family against me without them realizing it. At family gatherings, she'd volunteer me for dish duty or babysitting the younger cousins while everyone else played games or watched movies together. Jamie is so responsible and mature. She actually offered to help. Meanwhile, I never offered anything but learned that arguing made me look difficult and ungrateful. This went on for 4 years from when I was 13 to 17. Rachel had successfully made me a ghost in my own family, while maintaining this image of the devoted stepmother who tried so hard to include her difficult stepchild. The breaking point came during my senior year. I'd been accepted early decision to my dream college with a partial scholarship. It was this huge achievement that I'd worked for years to accomplish. The acceptance letter came in December, and I was beyond excited to share the news at Christmas dinner with the whole extended family there. Rachel knew about it because the letter came to the house, but she acted thrilled and said we'd make a big announcement at dinner to celebrate properly. Christmas Day arrived, and we had about 20 relatives over. Rachel had decorated everything perfectly and made this elaborate dinner. Right before we sat down to eat, she stood up with her champagne glass to make an announcement. She started talking about how proud she was of her family and all their accomplishments this year. She mentioned Tyler making the honor roll and Madison winning her dance competition. Then she paused dramatically and said, "But the biggest news is that Tyler just found out he's been selected for the State Youth Orchestra." Everyone erupted in congratulations for Tyler. I sat there waiting for her to mention my college acceptance, but she just raised her glass for a toast to Tyler and sat down. I was completely stunned. My Aunt Linda asked if anyone else had news to share, and Rachel actually said, "Oh yes, Jamie got into college too," and then immediately changed the subject to ask about dessert preferences. That's when something in me snapped. I stood up and said, "Actually, I'd like to share something important." The room went quiet and Rachel's face tightened, but she couldn't stop me without looking weird. I pulled out my phone and started reading the acceptance letter out loud. The one that came 2 weeks ago, that Rachel has known about this entire time. I made sure to emphasize the partial scholarship and the early decision acceptance rate of only 8%. Then I said, "You know what's funny? Rachel told me we'd celebrate this properly at dinner, but I guess Tyler's news, which she's known about for months, was more important to announce. Actually, that's been the pattern for 4 years now, hasn't it, Rachel?" The room went completely silent. Aunt Linda set down her wine glass and her voice cut through the quiet. She said she always wondered why I was never in the family photos Rachel posted on Facebook. She said it seemed weird, but Rachel always had an explanation that made sense at the time. My uncle started nodding and said yeah. Now that he thought about it, I was missing from basically everything for the past 4 years. Another aunt chimed in about the beach trip last summer where Rachel said I had to study for the SATs. Then my cousin from Dad's side mentioned the ski weekend where I supposedly had the flu. One by one, relatives started listing times I wasn't there, and Rachel's excuses for each one. Rachel's face went from red to white in about 10 seconds. She gripped the edge of the table and I could see her knuckles turning pale. Her carefully built story was falling apart in front of everyone and she couldn't stop it. Aubrey leaned forward and looked right at me. She said she thought I was being a bratty teenager who didn't want to spend time with the family. She said she actually complained to her mom about me being stuck up and antisocial. But now she was seeing that every single time I was absent, Rachel had given some reason that made it sound like my choice or my schedule or my preference. Aubrey's mom jumped in and said she remembered Rachel always positioning me for dish duty at gatherings while saying I had offered to help. My uncle said he thought it was strange that I was always babysitting the little kids instead of hanging out with everyone else. Another relative mentioned the matching Christmas pajamas and how mine were always missing or wrong size or lost in shipping. The connections were happening fast now. People were remembering things they'd brushed off as coincidence or bad luck. Rachel's system only worked when people looked at each incident alone. Put them all together, and the pattern was obvious. Rachel's voice came out shaky when she finally spoke. She said I was being dramatic and taking things out of context. She said blended families are hard and sometimes there are scheduling conflicts. She said she tried her best to include me, but I was difficult and standoffish. Her words sounded hollow even to her because she couldn't look at anyone while she said them. She kept staring at her plate and her hands were shaking. Dad sat there like someone had hit him with a brick. His face went through about 5 different emotions in 30 seconds. Confusion, then denial, then recognition, then horror. He looked at Rachel like he was seeing a stranger. Then he looked at me, and I could see him trying to remember the past 4 years through this new lens. He opened his mouth twice, but nothing came out. The man who always had an explanation for everything suddenly had no words. Tyler pushed his chair back, and the scraping sound made everyone jump. His voice was quiet, but everyone heard him. He said he remembered Mom buying my Christmas pajamas back in October. He said he saw them in her closet with the tags still on them. He said she told him they didn't fit right and she was going to return them, but they never made it under the tree. Madison stared at her plate so hard I thought she might burn a hole through it. She wouldn't look up and her shoulders were hunched like she was trying to disappear. Tyler kept going. He said there were other times too. Times when plans changed at the last minute and I ended up staying home. Times when Mom said I had other things to do, but he never actually heard me say that. I realized both of them had probably known way more than I thought. They'd watched it happen and said nothing because speaking up meant going against their mom. My grandfather Owen pushed himself up from his chair. His hands were shaking and his voice cracked when he started talking. He said he was ashamed of himself. He said I was his granddaughter and he let this happen right in front of him without seeing it. He said he believed every excuse Rachel gave without questioning why his granddaughter was never around. He said he failed me and he was sorry. His eyes were wet, and that's when I started crying too. My Aunt Linda had tears running down her face. Aubrey was crying. Even some of the cousins looked upset. The whole room felt heavy with this realization that they'd all missed something important happening to someone they loved. Owen sat back down hard and put his face in his hands. My dad reached out like he wanted to touch my arm, but I pulled away. I couldn't handle him touching me right then. Rachel stood up so fast her chair almost fell over. She didn't say anything, just walked straight to the kitchen. I could hear her rummaging around, then the sound of her voice on the phone. She was talking fast and her voice kept getting higher. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. She was upset and looking for backup, probably calling her sister who always took her side no matter what. Dad got up and followed her to the kitchen. At first their voices were low, but within a minute they were yelling. Dad's voice boomed through the house asking how he missed this. Rachel's voice shot back saying I was manipulating everyone. Dad said something about the Facebook photos. Rachel said something about me being jealous of her kids. Their fight echoed through the whole first floor and everyone at the table could hear every word. Aunt Linda moved to the empty chair next to me. She put her hand on my shoulder and I didn't pull away from her. She said she was sorry for every time she accepted Rachel's explanations without talking to me directly. She said she was sorry for every gathering where she watched me do dishes while everyone else had fun and didn't question it. She said she was sorry for not seeing that a 13-year-old kid wouldn't keep choosing to miss family events. She squeezed my shoulder and asked if I had somewhere to go tonight if I needed to leave. I shook my head. She said she had a guest room and I could stay as long as I needed. No questions asked, no conditions, just a safe place if I wanted it. I nodded because I couldn't speak without totally losing it. The extended family broke apart like someone had released them from frozen positions. Some relatives came over to hug me or pat my shoulder or tell me they believed me. Others stood in small groups talking in low voices about what they'd just witnessed. I heard fragments of conversations. Someone mentioned the water park trip. Someone else brought up the vacation timing. My uncle was telling his wife about the science fair conflict. Aubrey's mom was on her phone probably texting other family members what happened. The perfect Christmas dinner Rachel had planned for weeks was completely destroyed. The fancy decorations and expensive food didn't matter anymore. Her carefully arranged seating chart was useless. This was supposed to be her moment to show off her perfect blended family. Instead, it turned into an intervention she never saw coming. The turkey was getting cold on the table. Nobody was eating. I couldn't sit there anymore with everyone looking at me and talking about me even though they meant well. I got up and walked fast toward the bathroom. My legs felt shaky and my chest was tight. I locked the door behind me, and that's when everything I'd been holding in for 4 years hit me all at once. I slid down to sit on the floor with my back against the door. The sobs came so hard I couldn't breathe right. My whole body was shaking and I couldn't make it stop. My hands trembled so bad I had to press them against the cold tile floor. 4 years of being invisible. 4 years of watching my family have fun without me. 4 years of wondering if I was crazy for thinking something was wrong. 4 years of expensive guilt gifts that never made up for missing everything that mattered. It all came out in gasping, choking sobs that I tried to muffle so nobody would hear. Someone knocked softly on the bathroom door after a while. I wiped my face and tried to breathe normally, but my voice still came out rough when I said I'd be out in a minute. Melissa Hodges said it was just her and could she show me something. I opened the door and she slipped inside with her phone. She pulled up her photo albums and started scrolling. Easter 2 years ago. Thanksgiving last year. 4th of July party. Dad's birthday. Owen's retirement celebration. Photo after photo from family gatherings over the past 4 years. In every single one, I was either missing completely or positioned at the very edge of the frame where I could easily be cropped out. In the ones where I was visible, I was always slightly behind everyone else or off to the side. Melissa said she never noticed the pattern until tonight. She said she just thought I was camera shy or preferred to stay out of photos. But looking at all of them together, it was clear this was intentional. Every single time. She hugged me and said she believed me and she was sorry nobody saw it sooner. I walked back out to the dining room and that's when Dad came out of the kitchen. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. His face was gray and his eyes were red and he couldn't seem to stand up straight. He asked if we could talk privately and his voice cracked on the last word. I nodded and followed him upstairs. Rachel stayed in the kitchen and I could still hear her on the phone. Her voice was high and defensive and she kept saying things like, "You don't understand and she's always been difficult." We went into my room and Dad closed the door behind us. He sat on the edge of my bed and put his head in his hands. Then he started apologizing. He said he was sorry and he didn't realize and he'd been so busy with work. He said Rachel seemed to have everything under control with the family stuff, so he just let her handle it. He kept making excuses about his schedule and how Rachel was so good at organizing things and how he trusted her to include everyone. I stood by my dresser with my arms crossed and waited for him to finish. When he finally looked up at me, I told him that was exactly the problem. He stopped paying attention to me. He handed over his daughter to someone who didn't want me around, and then he just checked out. He tried to argue that he didn't check out, but I cut him off. I asked him when was the last time he came to one of my soccer games. When was the last time he asked me about school without Rachel prompting him? When was the last time we did something just the two of us? He couldn't answer any of it. Dad said he wanted to fix everything right now. He said we could set up family therapy and have a big talk with Rachel and work this all out. I laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. I told him you can't repair 4 years of damage in one conversation. You can't just apologize and make it all go away. He looked like I'd punched him in the stomach. His face crumpled and he started crying. Real crying with his shoulders shaking. He said he failed me as a father and he was so sorry. I felt bad seeing him cry, but I also felt angry because where was this emotion for the past 4 years? Aunt Linda knocked on the door and asked if I wanted to stay at her house for a few days. She said she had a guest room and I could have some space to think. Dad looked panicked and started to say no, but I said yes before he could finish. I told him I needed time away from this house and away from Rachel. He looked devastated, but he nodded. I pulled my duffel bag out of my closet and started throwing clothes into it. Dad sat on my bed watching me pack and crying quietly. I grabbed my toothbrush from the bathroom and my phone charger and my laptop. Downstairs, I could hear Rachel's voice getting louder. She was yelling now about how I ruined Christmas and how ungrateful I was after everything she'd done for me. She was telling whoever was on the phone that she tried so hard with me, but I never appreciated anything. I heard her say that the expensive gifts and the nice room and the private school were all wasted on me. Dad heard it too, and his face went even more pale. I zipped up my bag and told him I'd call him in a few days. He asked if he could hug me, and I let him, but I didn't hug back. My body felt stiff and cold, and I just wanted to leave. When I came back downstairs with my bag, several relatives were still there. They'd heard Rachel yelling, and they looked uncomfortable. Aunt Linda was waiting by the front door with her coat on. My uncle came over and hugged me tight. He said he was sorry he didn't see what was happening, and he promised to stay in touch directly, instead of going through Rachel. A few other relatives hugged me too and said similar things. They gave me their phone numbers and told me to call anytime. Tyler was standing near the stairs, and when I looked at him, he mouthed, "I'm sorry." That surprised me because Tyler usually just went along with whatever Rachel wanted. His eyes looked sad and guilty. Madison was nowhere to be seen. Rachel came out of the kitchen right as I was leaving. Her face was red and blotchy from crying and yelling. She tried to say something to me, but Aunt Linda stepped between us and said, "Not now, Rachel." We walked out to Aunt Linda's car and I threw my bag in the back seat. At Aunt Linda's house, she made tea and we sat at her kitchen table. She told me to talk and just let everything out. So I did. For 2 straight hours, I told her every single incident I could remember from the past 4 years. The water park trip where there weren't enough tickets. The vacation that conflicted with my science fair. The matching Christmas pajamas that never arrived. The family photos where I was always on the edge. The way Rachel volunteered me for dish duty at every gathering. The expensive guilt gifts that came after I missed important events. Every time I was left home alone while they did something fun. Every Facebook post that claimed to include all the kids but never showed me. Aunt Linda took notes on her phone. She said she was documenting everything in case I needed it later. I didn't know what that meant, but I was glad someone was finally listening and believing me. My phone started going crazy with messages. I pulled it out and saw texts from different family members. Some were supportive, saying they believed me and they were sorry. Others were angry, saying I caused a scene at Christmas and embarrassed the family. One message from Rachel's sister called me ungrateful and spoiled. Another from my cousin said I was being dramatic and Rachel always tried her best. I read through them all and felt sick. Even with everything that happened, some people still thought I was the problem. I turned my phone completely off and put it in my bag. Aunt Linda made up the guest room with fresh sheets and gave me some of her daughter's old pajamas to wear. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept going over the confrontation. Rachel's face when I started reading the letter. The silence in the room. Melissa showing me all those photos. Dad crying in my room. Rachel yelling about how ungrateful I was. It all played on repeat in my head. The next morning, Aunt Linda's phone rang early. She answered it in the kitchen, and I heard her say yes. She's here and she's fine. Then she came to the guest room and said Dad wanted to meet me for breakfast. He'd called asking if we could talk at the diner on Main Street. She said he sounded like he hadn't slept at all. He told her he stayed up all night going through old photos and Facebook posts. I got dressed and Aunt Linda drove me to the diner. Dad was already there in a booth by the window. He looked terrible. His eyes were puffy and red and he had the same clothes on from yesterday. There was coffee in front of him, but it looked cold and untouched. I slid into the booth across from him, and he immediately pulled out his phone. He'd pulled up Rachel's Facebook timeline going back 4 years. He started scrolling and showing me post after post. Easter 2 years ago with photos of Tyler and Madison hunting eggs. No mention of me. Thanksgiving last year with the whole family around the table. I wasn't in the photo. 4th of July party at the lake. Tyler and Madison on the boat. No Jamie. Dad's birthday dinner. Family photo with everyone dressed up. I'm not there. On and on and on. Hundreds of photos over 4 years. In the ones where I appeared at all, I was blurry in the background or cut off at the edge. Every caption talked about blessed family time or quality time with all my kids, but I was missing from almost every single one. Dad said he never looked at Rachel's Facebook much because he lived the actual moments. But seeing it all together like this, he finally saw the pattern. He said it was like scales falling from his eyes. Dad put his phone down and looked at me across the table. He said he got comfortable letting Rachel handle all the family planning and scheduling. He said it was easier to let her coordinate everything because she seemed to enjoy it, and he was busy with work. He stopped checking in with me about how I felt or what I wanted to do. He just assumed if there was a problem, I'd tell him. But I had tried to tell him, and he always believed Rachel's explanations. He said he chose the easy path, and it cost him his relationship with his daughter. He said he failed me as a father, and he didn't know if I could ever forgive him. His voice broke, and tears ran down his face right there in the diner. I sat there looking at this broken man across from me and didn't know what to say. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. I told him I appreciated him finally seeing it, but this wasn't something we could fix in one breakfast. He nodded and wiped his eyes with his napkin. Then I walked him through the college acceptance situation step by step. I explained how the letter arrived 2 weeks before Christmas and how excited I was. I told him Rachel seemed genuinely happy for me when I showed her. She said we'd make a big announcement at dinner to celebrate properly with the whole family there. I described sitting at that table on Christmas Day waiting for her to mention it after she announced Tyler's orchestra news. The way she dismissed my achievement with 5 words before changing the subject. Dad's face went gray as he listened. He said he remembered that moment, but hadn't registered what happened because he was caught up in congratulating Tyler. He pulled up his calendar app and showed me that Rachel had known about Tyler's orchestra acceptance since October. She'd waited 2 months to announce it specifically for Christmas dinner. The timing wasn't coincidental at all. It was calculated to overshadow my news that she knew was coming. Dad looked like he might throw up right there in the diner. The waitress came by to refill our coffee and asked if we wanted to order food, but neither of us could eat. Dad paid for the coffee and we sat there for another hour while he asked me about other incidents. Every question led to another memory of Rachel's carefully constructed exclusions. Finally, he said we should go back to the house, so he could talk to Rachel with me there. I wasn't sure I wanted to face her yet, but I also didn't want Dad getting manipulated into believing her version of events again. On the drive home, he told me about the fight they had after I left on Christmas night. He said Rachel was furious that I embarrassed her in front of the whole family. She kept saying I was exaggerating everything and being manipulative. She told him I'd always been difficult and ungrateful no matter how hard she tried. Dad said he started to believe her at first because that's what he always did. But then Aunt Linda called him at midnight and told him to look at Rachel's Facebook timeline. That's when he started going through 4 years of posts and photos. He said seeing it all together made him sick to his stomach. Rachel had created this whole false narrative online while systematically erasing me from the actual family. He admitted he was starting to see her differently, but he also said he still loved her and didn't know what to do. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose between us. I just needed him to acknowledge what happened and stop making excuses for her behavior. I needed him to see that this wasn't about me being difficult or her trying her best. This was about deliberate exclusion disguised as accidents for 4 years. Dad pulled into the driveway and turned off the car. He promised he'd start individual therapy to understand how he missed everything. He said he wanted to be a better father, even if it was too late to fix the past. We sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. When we walked through the front door, Rachel was waiting in the living room. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Her eyes were red and puffy like she'd been crying all night. She had tissues in her hand and she stood up when she saw us. She started talking immediately in this rehearsed way about how sorry she was that I felt was excluded. She said she never meant to make me feel invisible, and she'd tried so hard to blend our family. Every sentence focused on her intentions and her efforts and her feelings. She kept saying she did her best and blended families are hard. I let her finish her whole prepared speech. Then I told her I didn't want her apology right now. I said she wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. There's a big difference. Rachel's face crumpled and she started crying harder. She said I was being cruel and unforgiving. She said she was trying to make things right and I wouldn't even give her a chance. I stayed calm and told her I needed time to process 4 years of systematic exclusion. Her apology, focusing on her intentions rather than the impact of her actions, told me she still didn't get it. That's when Tyler walked into the room. He looked at Rachel crying and then at me standing there with Dad. He told Rachel to stop. His voice was quiet but firm. He said he'd watched her exclude me for years and said nothing because it was easier. He said he knew about the matching pajamas that never came. He knew about the vacation dates that always conflicted with my schedule. He knew she positioned me out of family photos on purpose. He said he was ashamed he stayed silent, but he wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Rachel stared at Tyler like he'd slapped her. Madison appeared in the doorway but didn't say anything. She just stood there looking at the floor. The fact that Madison didn't defend her seemed to shock Rachel more than Tyler speaking up. Rachel's crying shifted to anger. She said she tried her best with a difficult stepdaughter who never gave her a chance. She said I always rejected her efforts to bond and made everything harder. She turned to Dad expecting him to back her up like he always did. But Dad spoke up instead. He said the evidence didn't support that story. He said he'd spent all night looking at 4 years of documentation that showed a clear pattern. He said Rachel's Facebook posts alone proved she was creating a narrative that didn't match reality. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. I went upstairs to my room and started packing a bag with more clothes and my laptop. I could hear Rachel's voice getting louder downstairs as she argued with Dad. Tyler appeared in my doorway and asked if I was leaving again. I told him I was staying at Aunt Linda's through New Year, and then we'd figure out next steps. He nodded and said he understood. He apologized again for not speaking up sooner. I told him I appreciated him finally saying something, but it didn't erase 4 years. He said he knew that and he wasn't expecting it to. I grabbed my bag and headed back downstairs. Dad was standing in the hallway looking exhausted. I told him I'd call him in a few days and we could talk more. Rachel came out of the living room with tears streaming down her face. She tried to say something, but I walked past her to the front door. Her sobs followed me out to Dad's car. He drove me to Aunt Linda's house without either of us saying much. When we pulled up, Aunt Linda was already waiting on the porch. Dad helped me carry my stuff inside and hugged me before leaving. Aunt Linda made tea and let me decompress without asking a million questions. I turned my phone off again and tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the confrontation with Rachel. Winter break ended and I went back to the school in January. My guidance counselor noticed I seemed off during our meeting about final semester grades. She asked if everything was okay at home. I ended up telling her everything about Christmas dinner and Rachel and the past 4 years. She listened without interrupting and then connected me with the school therapist. She also helped me get extensions on some assignments I'd missed over break. The school therapist specialized in family dynamics, which Aunt Linda had mentioned when recommending her. In our first session, I explained the whole situation from the beginning. When I finished, she said what Rachel did has a name: covert emotional abuse. She said it's a form of manipulation where the abuser maintains a positive public image while systematically undermining their victim in private ways. Having language for it made me feel less crazy. The therapist said children in blended families often experience this but struggle to identify it because the actions seem small individually. It's only when you look at the pattern over time that you see the systematic nature of the exclusion. She said my decision to speak up at Christmas took tremendous courage because I was challenging a carefully constructed family narrative. We scheduled weekly sessions to work through the trauma and develop healthy boundaries going forward. A few days into my therapy sessions, my phone buzzed with a text from Aubrey. She said she talked to her mom about everything that happened at Christmas, and it made her realize her own stepdad had been doing similar things for years. She thanked me for being brave enough to speak up, because it helped her see patterns she'd been ignoring. I stared at that message for a long time. It felt weird to think my mess could help someone else make sense of theirs. I texted back that I was glad it helped and we should talk more when things calmed down. She sent back a heart emoji and said she was there if I needed to vent. That same week, Dad started going to therapy on his own. He called me every Tuesday night after his sessions to update me on what he was learning. The first call was awkward because he kept apologizing and I didn't know what to say. He told me his therapist was helping him understand enabler behavior and how he'd chosen to believe Rachel's version of things because it was easier than facing the truth. He said he prioritized his marriage over his daughter, and that was unforgivable. I told him it wasn't about forgiveness right now. It was about him actually changing things going forward. The calls kept coming every week and they got easier but also harder. He'd share things his therapist pointed out about specific incidents, and I'd have to relive them while he processed them for the first time. It was painful but necessary. On the third week of therapy sessions, Rachel sent me a long email. The subject line said we need to talk, and I almost deleted it without reading. But I opened it and started scrolling through paragraph after paragraph of her explaining her side. She wrote about how hard it is to blend families, and how she always felt like I never gave her a chance. She said she tried so hard to include me, but I kept pulling away and making things difficult. She talked about feeling like an outsider in her own home because Dad and I had such a strong bond. The email went on for pages about her struggles and her good intentions. I screenshot the whole thing and brought it to my next therapy session. My therapist read through it carefully and then started pointing out all the manipulation tactics embedded in the text. She showed me how Rachel focused on her own feelings instead of acknowledging the harm she caused. How she turned herself into the victim and made my reaction sound like the problem. How she used words like always and never to distort reality. My therapist said this was classic DARVO, which stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. Rachel was denying what she did, attacking my character and positioning herself as the real victim. Seeing it laid out like that made me feel less crazy. I wasn't imagining things or being dramatic. This was a real pattern with a name. A few days after that email, Aunt Linda called and suggested we try family mediation with our church pastor. She meant well and thought it might help everyone communicate better. I told her I appreciated the idea, but I wasn't ready for that yet. I needed time to process everything without pressure to forgive or reconcile immediately. She understood and said she'd support whatever timeline I needed. She also mentioned the pastor was available if I wanted to talk one-on-one without the whole family involved. I said maybe later, but not now. In early February, my college sent a big packet of information about Accepted Students Weekend. There were forms to fill out and a schedule of campus tours and meetings with professors. I looked at the dates and realized it fell on a weekend when I'd normally be expected to do something with the family. I called Dad and asked if he'd come with me to the college visit. He said yes immediately without even checking his calendar. He promised Rachel wouldn't interfere with this, and he'd make sure she understood this was just for us. I felt relieved and scared at the same time. The weekend arrived and Dad picked me up early Saturday morning. We drove 3 hours to the campus, and the whole time he asked questions about my intended major and what classes I was excited about. It felt normal in a way things hadn't felt normal in years. When we got to campus, I couldn't stop smiling. The buildings were old and covered in ivy, and there were students everywhere looking happy and busy. We went to the information sessions and toured the dorms and ate lunch in the student center. Dad watched me take everything in, and I could see his eyes getting watery. After the official tour ended, we walked around campus on our own. Dad stopped near the library and told me he was proud of me, but wished he'd protected this dream better. His voice cracked and he had to look away. I told him we couldn't change the past 4 years, but we could change what happened next. He nodded and wiped his eyes, and we kept walking. On the drive home, we had the most honest conversation we'd ever had about how our relationship would work going forward. I told him I wanted him in my life, but I needed him to respect my boundaries with Rachel. That meant not pushing me to forgive her or pretend everything was fine. It meant not making excuses for her behavior or asking me to understand her perspective. It meant choosing me sometimes even when it made his marriage harder. Dad listened without interrupting and said he understood. He said his therapist was helping him see how he'd failed at exactly those things for 4 years. When we pulled into the driveway, I felt good about where we'd left things. Then I walked into the house and saw my bedroom door open. I always kept it closed. I went upstairs and stopped in the doorway. Rachel had completely redecorated my room. New curtains, new bedspread, new throw pillows, everything in shades of purple and gray. There was a note on my desk that said surprise, and I hope this helps you feel more at home. I felt my chest get tight and my hands started shaking. She went into my private space without asking. She touched my things and moved them around and changed everything. Dad came up behind me and asked what was wrong. I pointed at the room and said she did this without my permission. She came into my space and redecorated like it was hers to change. Dad looked confused at first, like he didn't understand why I was upset. Then something clicked and his face changed. He said, "Oh." He finally got it. He finally understood why I felt so violated by her constant boundary crossing. This wasn't a nice gesture. This was another way of controlling my space and making decisions about my life without including me. I told Dad I was moving back home, but things had to be different. I needed strict rules about my space and my time. Rachel and I would interact minimally. I'd keep my door locked. Family activities would be optional for me, not mandatory. Dad agreed to enforce these boundaries and said he'd talk to Rachel that night. I spent the evening at Aunt Linda's while Dad had that conversation. When I came back the next day, Rachel's eyes were red, but she didn't try to talk to me. I went straight to my room and locked the door. Over the next few weeks, Rachel really struggled with the new dynamic. She kept trying to force conversations about healing our relationship. She'd knock on my door and ask if we could talk. She'd text me asking when I'd be ready to work on things. She'd leave notes around the house about family being important. Dad had to keep reminding her to give me space. I'd hear him through the walls telling her to stop pushing and let me come to her when I was ready. Sometimes she'd cry and say this wasn't fair. Sometimes she'd get angry and say I was being cruel. But Dad held the line for the first time in 4 years. He told her my boundaries weren't negotiable, and she needed to respect them whether she agreed with them or not. A few weeks later, Tyler came home waving an acceptance letter for the state orchestra's summer intensive program. Rachel called everyone into the living room and made a big announcement about how proud she was. Dad stood up right after she finished talking and said he wanted to add something. He pulled out his phone and showed everyone the email from my college with my scholarship details, and said both his kids had amazing news to celebrate. Tyler looked uncomfortable for a second, but then he came over and high-fived me. We ordered pizza, and Dad kept switching between talking about Tyler's program and my college plans, like he was making sure everything stayed balanced. Rachel sat quietly on the couch and didn't try to take over the conversation. It felt weird, but also kind of good to have something that didn't turn into a competition. That night, Madison knocked on my locked bedroom door and asked if she could come in. I opened it, and she stood there looking at her feet. She said she was sorry for staying quiet all these years and that she knew what Rachel was doing, but she was too scared to say anything. I told her I understood being scared of making Rachel mad, but that staying silent let the abuse continue. She started crying and said she knew that now and wished she'd been braver. I didn't hug her or tell her it was okay because it wasn't really okay, but I said we could try to be actual sisters from here on out. She nodded and left, and I locked my door again. The next week, I had my therapy appointment and brought up the idea of writing a letter to Rachel. My therapist thought it was a good idea to put my needs in writing, so there was no confusion about boundaries. We spent the whole session working on it together. I listed specific incidents like the Christmas pajamas and the vacation conflicts and the college announcement. I wrote that I needed her to acknowledge these things actually happened and weren't accidents or misunderstandings. I said I needed her to stop trying to force conversations about healing and let me come to her when I was ready. I needed her to respect my locked door and my privacy. I needed her to stop volunteering me for things without asking first. The letter was 3 pages long by the time we finished. My therapist helped me take out the parts that were just angry and keep the parts that clearly stated what had to change. I printed it out that night and left it on the kitchen counter for Rachel to find in the morning. 3 days later, there was an envelope on my desk with my name on it. Rachel's response letter started defensive, saying I was being unfair, and she'd tried her best with a difficult situation. But then halfway through, the tone changed. She admitted the Christmas pajamas thing was intentional, because she wanted matching photos with just her bio kids. She said she did plan activities when I had conflicts because it was easier than dealing with me. She wrote that she felt threatened by my relationship with Dad and tried to minimize my presence. It wasn't everything I wanted her to admit, but my therapist said it was more accountability than most people ever get from their abusers. In March, Aunt Linda invited me to dinner at her house with just the family members who'd supported me after Christmas. Owen was there, and so were a few cousins, including Aubrey. Nobody brought up Rachel or the drama. We just ate and talked and laughed like normal people. Aunt Linda made my favorite dessert, and Owen told embarrassing stories about Dad when he was young. It felt really good to be around people who actually saw me and believed me without me having to prove anything. On the drive home, I felt lighter than I had in months. A week later, Dad told me he and Rachel were starting couples therapy. He said the therapist recommended it after his individual sessions. He looked tired when he told me their marriage might not survive this whole thing. I felt guilty for a second, like maybe I should take some of it back to keep his marriage together. But then I felt relieved because maybe he'd finally be free of her manipulation too. He said no matter what happened with Rachel, he was committed to fixing things with me. The financial aid package from college arrived in early April. I opened it at the kitchen table with my hands shaking. The scholarship covered almost half of tuition, and the financial aid covered most of the rest. Between that and the small amount I'd saved from my part-time job, I could actually afford to go without asking Dad for much help at all. I ran upstairs and called Aunt Linda to tell her. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Dad came home and I showed him the numbers and he hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. For the next few weeks, Rachel actually respected my boundaries. She didn't knock on my door or leave notes around the house. She didn't try to corner me for conversations about our relationship. When we passed each other in the hallway, she just nodded and kept walking. The house felt less tense and I could breathe easier. I started thinking maybe we could actually maintain this distance until I left for college in August. My school held the senior award ceremony in the auditorium on a Tuesday night in April. I'd asked Dad to come alone and he did. I won 3 different academic scholarships that got announced on stage. Each time they called my name, Dad stood up and clapped louder than anyone else in the room. His face was red and he had this huge smile and I could see he was trying not to cry. After the ceremony, he took me out for ice cream and told me how proud he was of everything I'd accomplished, despite how hard the last 4 years had been. That night when I got home, there was a text from Rachel. It just said, "Congratulations on your awards." For the first time, it didn't feel fake or like she was just doing it for show. I showed my therapist the next week and she said people can grow even if they can't undo the past. A week later, Tyler knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk. I almost said no out of habit, but something about the way he stood there looking nervous made me let him in. He sat on the edge of my desk chair and picked at a loose thread on his jeans for a solid minute before he started talking. He said he'd felt guilty about the favoritism for years but didn't know how to bring it up without making things worse. He admitted he knew about the missing Christmas pajamas and the vacation conflicts and how Rachel always positioned me out of photos. He said he told himself it wasn't his problem and that speaking up would just cause drama. Then he looked at me and said he was sorry for taking the easy path and letting me deal with everything alone. I didn't know what to say at first because I'd spent 4 years thinking Tyler was just as bad as Rachel, but sitting there watching him actually own his part in it made something shift. I told him I appreciated the apology and that maybe we could try being actual siblings instead of strangers living in the same house. He smiled for the first time since entering my room and said he'd like that. We talked for another hour about random stuff like his orchestra program and my college plans, and it felt surprisingly normal. Prom happened in early May, and I'd been dreading it because Rachel had this way of inserting herself into every milestone. But when I came downstairs in my dress, Dad was waiting alone with his camera, and this huge smile on his face. He took about 50 photos in the living room and kept making me laugh by doing embarrassing dad poses. He asked about my date and my plans for the night and actually listened to my answers instead of checking his phone. Rachel stayed upstairs the whole time and I could hear her moving around, but she never came down to see me off. Dad noticed me glancing at the stairs and he squeezed my shoulder and said, "This moment was just for us." My date arrived and Dad shook his hand and did the whole protective father routine, which was embarrassing but also kind of nice. As we left, I saw Rachel watching from the upstairs window, but she didn't wave or try to come down. Dad texted me later that night saying he hoped I was having fun and to be safe. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything because he was actually showing up for me. 3 weeks before graduation, Dad asked what kind of celebration I wanted. I'd been thinking about it for days because part of me wanted something big to prove I'd made it despite everything. But mostly I just wanted to be around people who actually cared about me. I told him I wanted something small with just the relatives who showed up for me at Christmas, and he said he'd make it happen. He called Aunt Linda that night and they planned everything together. No elaborate party or huge guest list, just the people who'd believed me when I finally spoke up. Dad asked if I wanted to invite any friends from the school, and I realized I'd been so focused on surviving at home that I hadn't built many close friendships. That stung a little, but I told myself college would be different. 2 weeks before graduation, Rachel knocked on my door and asked if she could attend the ceremony. My first instinct was to say no, because I didn't want her there pretending to be proud of me for everyone else's benefit. But I talked to my therapist about this exact scenario, and she'd helped me think through what boundaries I needed. I told Rachel she could come, but she needed to sit separately from Dad and me. She looked like she wanted to argue, but then she just nodded and said she understood. She asked if she could take photos, and I said only if I was okay with it in the moment. She agreed without pushing back, which honestly surprised me. After she left, I texted my therapist and told her it went better than expected. She replied saying I was learning to set boundaries without anger, and that was real growth. Graduation day arrived on a sunny Saturday morning in June. I put on my cap and gown in my bedroom and looked at myself in the mirror. 4 years ago, I'd been this confused 13-year-old who thought she was going crazy. Now I was 17, and walking across a stage knowing I'd survived something that could have broken me. The ceremony was long and boring like all graduations, but when they called my name, I heard Aunt Linda whistle loudly from the audience. Dad was standing up clapping, and even Tyler was on his feet cheering. Owen was there too, and I could see him wiping his eyes. I grabbed my diploma and looked out at all of them and felt this wave of relief that I'd made it. Rachel was sitting in the back like we'd agreed, and she was clapping, but she stayed in her seat. After the ceremony, Dad found me first and hugged me, so tight I could barely breathe. He kept saying he was proud of me over and over. Aunt Linda hosted the small celebration at her house that afternoon. She'd made all my favorite foods and decorated with my school colors. Only about 15 people came, but they were all people who'd shown up for me when it mattered. Family members took turns sharing memories of my achievements over the years. My cousin Aubrey talked about how I'd helped her with math homework every summer. Owen told everyone about the science fair project I'd done in 8th grade that won first place. Then Dad stood up to give a speech, and his voice cracked right away. He apologized for missing so much and for not seeing what was happening in his own house. He promised to do better and to actually be present in my life instead of just going through the motions. He said watching me succeed despite everything made him realize how strong I was, but that I shouldn't have had to be that strong. Everyone was crying by the end, including me. Rachel didn't come to the celebration, which was her choice. Aunt Linda had invited her to be polite, but Rachel sent a text saying she thought it was best if she stayed home. At first I felt guilty, like maybe I should have pushed harder for her to be included. But then I realized this was actually healthy. Not everything has to include everyone, and sometimes separation is what people need. My therapist had said that boundaries aren't about punishment. They're about protecting yourself. Rachel not being there meant I could actually relax and enjoy my celebration without worrying about her making it awkward or trying to take credit for my success. I was okay with her absence, and that felt like progress. The next week, Dad asked if I wanted to go shopping for college supplies. We spent the whole day driving around to different stores, picking out bedding and desk organizers and all the random stuff the college said I'd need. Dad asked questions about my classes and my roommate and actually listened to my answers. He wanted to know what I was most excited about and what scared me. We stopped for lunch and talked about how often I'd come home to visit. He said he knew I needed space but hoped I wouldn't disappear completely. I promised I'd come back for Thanksgiving and winter break. He bought way more stuff than I needed and kept adding things to the cart, saying he wanted to make sure I had everything. By the end of the day, the car was packed full and my feet hurt from walking, but it felt really good to spend time with him without Rachel hovering or making everything about Tyler and Madison. In July, Rachel texted asking if we could have coffee and talk before I left for college. I stared at the message for 10 minutes trying to decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but my therapist had been working with me on not avoiding difficult conversations. I agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown with a set time limit of 1 hour. I told Rachel we'd meet at 2, and I had another commitment at 3, so we couldn't go over. She responded right away saying that worked for her. The day of the meeting, I was so nervous I almost canceled 3 times. But I showed up at the coffee shop and Rachel was already there waiting. She'd ordered her drink but hadn't gotten me anything, which I actually appreciated because it meant she wasn't trying to do some big gesture. We sat down and she thanked me for agreeing to meet. Rachel started talking, and for once she didn't make excuses or try to rewrite history. She admitted she'd felt threatened by my relationship with Dad from the beginning. She said watching him with me made her worry she'd never be as important to him as I was. So she tried to minimize my presence in the family to secure her own place. She said it started small with little scheduling conflicts, but then it became this whole pattern she couldn't stop. She admitted the Christmas dinner thing with my college acceptance was calculated and cruel. She said she'd been in therapy for months trying to understand why she did it, and that feeling threatened didn't excuse any of it. It was the most honest she'd ever been with me, and I didn't know how to process it. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but that trust would take years to rebuild if it ever did. She cried, but she accepted it. We agreed to try occasional supervised contact after I was at college, but no promises about more than that. When I left the coffee shop, I felt exhausted, but also lighter somehow, like maybe we could eventually find some kind of peace, even if we'd never be close. I looked at Rachel across the table and took a deep breath before speaking. I told her I appreciated her being honest for once, but that trust would take years to rebuild if it ever did. She started crying and I handed her a napkin from the dispenser. She nodded and said she understood. We agreed to try occasional supervised contact after I got to college, but no promises about anything more than that. I paid for my coffee and left while she was still sitting there wiping her eyes. 2 weeks later, Dad called and asked if we could meet for lunch. He looked tired when I got to the restaurant, and he told me he and Rachel decided to separate for a while. He said he needed to focus on fixing things with me without the marriage getting in the way of that. I felt relieved, but also kind of sad for him because I knew this was hard. He promised he'd come visit me at college once a month and we'd keep working on our relationship. August came faster than I expected. Moving day arrived and I woke up at 6 in the morning with my stomach doing flips. Dad showed up at 8 with the truck and Tyler came with him. Aunt Linda pulled up right after with Owen in her passenger seat. We all started carrying boxes and bags down the stairs. Tyler grabbed my mini fridge and almost dropped it on the landing. Owen kept making jokes about how much stuff college students needed these days. The drive to campus took 2 hours, and we listened to my playlist the whole way. When we got there, the parking lot was packed with other families unloading cars. Dad found a spot near my building, and we formed a chain to move everything inside. My room was on the 3rd floor, and there was no elevator. By the time we finished carrying everything up, we were all sweating and exhausted. Aunt Linda helped me make my bed while Dad assembled my desk lamp. Tyler and Owen went to get lunch for everyone. We ate sandwiches sitting on my floor surrounded by unpacked boxes. Madison sent a text saying good luck and sorry she couldn't come help. After lunch, they started getting ready to leave. Aunt Linda hugged me for a long time and told me to call her whenever I needed anything. Owen slipped me $40 and said to buy myself something fun. Tyler gave me an awkward side hug and said he'd text me. Dad was the last one and he held me tight and told me how proud he was. I walked them all down to the parking lot and watched them climb into their vehicles. They drove away slowly, and I stood there on the sidewalk in front of my new building. I felt scared and hopeful at the same time. I survived 4 years of being invisible, and now I got to find out who I was when people actually saw me. That's where we'll stop for today. I'm really glad you were here because it makes telling these stories mean something. I hope this one brought a little comfort to your day.